regarding Hussein's remarks. Meanwhile, hostilities between the Israeli military and Hezbollah have persisted over the past 24 hours, heightening concerns of an expanded war. Today, the Israeli army targeted locations in southern Lebanon in response to approximately 30 rockets fired into its territory. The rocket attack was signaled by sirens in northern Israel at 11:02 a.m. local time, when two anti-tank missiles hit the border kibbutz of Manara. Residents of Manara and kibbutz Miskov were urged to seek shelter. Hezbollah claimed responsibility for the missile attack on Manara and additional anti-tank missile launches at Israel Defense Forces positions. Following this, sirens blared in the Upper Galilee, compelling residents of various settlements to take cover, although no injuries were reported at this time. In retaliation, Israeli forces targeted locations in southern Lebanon as rocket fire from Lebanon persisted. 3 individuals were reportedly injured when a shell struck a building in the municipality of Kiryat Shmona. The Lebanese television channel Al Manar aired footage of what it claimed was the aftermath of an IDF drone strike near Nakori in southern Lebanon. Concurrently, Israel is preparing for a substantial ground assault in the Gaza Strip, deploying hundreds of tanks, special forces, and armored vehicles in a bid to eradicate Hamas, positioned roughly 4 kilometers from Gaza. The Israeli military arsenal includes Merkava Mk4 main battle tanks, M113 armored personnel carriers, and M109 Paladin 155mm self-propelled howitzers, all poised for action. In recent days, Israeli special forces undertook localized infiltrations into Gaza in a bid to liberate hostages held by Hamas. Today, Israel's elite commando units mobilized for a hostage rescue operation, executing a critical mission near the city's tunnels, utilizing Mossad techniques, as well as the army's drone and thermal technologies. Hamas's headquarters were detected, and it was confirmed that the hostages were being held underground. Israeli commandos discreetly infiltrated the Hamas base, navigating through obstacles to access the subterranean tunnels. The IDF announced that a hostage rescue operation had been successfully executed by Israeli commandos against Hamas, resulting in the liberation of over 200 hostages. The operation also led to the neutralization of more than 70 Hamas members. Additionally, 26 Hamas members were apprehended, including Mohammed Abu Ali, the deputy commander of the Southern Marine Division. The IDF reported that Abu Ali has been taken into custody and is slated for interrogation. A full-scale ground offensive against Gaza by the IDF is now anticipated, a stark contrast to the sporadic exchanges of fire that have occurred in recent days. Contrary to earlier reports, it was Hamas in Lebanon, not Hezbollah, that claimed responsibility for the second barrage of rocket fire, with the group asserting that it had launched approximately 30 rockets into Israel on Thursday. Today's heavy rocket and missile barrage marks the most significant escalation on Israel's northern border since Hamas's attack on October 7. Over the past fortnight, Iranian-backed Hezbollah has intermittently fired anti-tank missiles, utilized rockets, and conducted drone strikes against Israeli communities in the north. This climate of belligerence has prompted heightened alertness globally. Yesterday, the U.S. Embassy in Lebanon issued a travel warning to American citizens, advising against travel to the country and urging those currently in Lebanon to make arrangements to depart. The British Embassy in Beirut echoed this advisory, as did the German government, issuing similar warnings to their respective citizens in Lebanon. Meanwhile, the U.S. announced a visa waiver for Israelis traveling to the U.S. for up to 90 days, expediting a travel benefit initially scheduled to commence on November 30th. This expedited timeline facilitates travel for Israelis seeking refuge from the ongoing Israel-Hamas war, bypassing the typical visa application process. The potential involvement of Lebanese Hezbollah in the Hamas-Israel war remains uncertain. While Hezbollah and Hamas share the common objective of eliminating the Jewish state, Hezbollah faces significant risks in engaging with Israel, which remains the preeminent military power in the Middle East, equipped with some of the world's most sophisticated weaponry, courtesy of U.S. support. Although Hezbollah's arsenal includes precision-guided missiles that surpass the outdated Soviet-era rockets employed in the 2006 conflict with Israel, it pales in comparison to Israel's military capabilities. Hezbollah's leader, Nasrallah, asserts that his forces exceed 100,000 in number. In response to the conflict, IDF spokesman Rear Admiral Daniel Hagar disclosed that hundreds of reservists have been deployed to assist in public diplomacy efforts during the war. Hagar remarked that we are confronted with a significant challenge in defending our legitimacy against an adversary that holds no regard for truth. This fight for legitimacy is arduous, formidable, and can often prove to be exasperating, yet it remains a duty of national importance. As tensions between Israel and Hezbollah show no signs of abating, the United States has been issuing advisories to both parties. Insider sources reveal that the Biden administration has been discreetly counseling Israel to refrain from initiating a military offensive against Hezbollah as part of wider efforts to confine the current war to Gaza. The United States acknowledges Israel's obligation to retaliate against Hezbollah's persistent targeting of its northern borders since the October 17th assault by Hamas. However, the sustained offensives by Hezbollah, coupled with Israel's misjudgment of Hamas's attack from Gaza, has fueled the debate regarding whether Israel should proactively wage a war against Hezbollah to gain the upper hand. According to officials, such discourse is alarming to the United States, which has both privately and publicly admonished Hezbollah and Iran against instigating a war on Israel's northern front. The U.S. has cautioned Israel to tread carefully in its military counteractions to Hezbollah's provocations, warning that any missteps by the Israeli military in Lebanon could escalate into a far-reaching war. In the event that Hezbollah declares war on Israel, officials have intimated that the U.S. military would join forces with the IDF to combat the militant group. As a show of support, the Pentagon has dispatched 2 aircraft carrier strike groups to the eastern Mediterranean, in proximity to Israel, as a deterrent against adversaries in the region. The Israeli Air Force targeted senior Hamas officials, while 30 separate airstrikes were carried out. Hezbollah officially announced that it would join the war if Israel entered Gaza. Hezbollah announced that it would launch a ground attack on Israel, but Israel made a statement that will shake the agenda. If Hezbollah attacks our lands, we will launch a major operation against Iran, where the Hezbollah terrorist organization was born and supported. In this process, I can say that the Israeli army is about to complete its final preparations for the land operation. In other words, the ground operation in Gaza can start at any moment, but this operation will be very dangerous. The Israeli army is far superior to Hamas in terms of military power, but there are thousands of unexpected traps in Gaza and Hamas tunnels all over the territory. Firstly, the Israeli forces continue to implement their plans for airstrikes in order to begin ground operations. The target is a member of the Hamas political bureau in Gaza. Israeli intelligence and the Israeli Air Force mobilized for a joint operation. According to the information received by Israeli intelligence, it published a report that Hamas officials held a meeting at a point on a Malmoun street in Gaza. Later, Israeli unmanned aerial vehicles took images from the region for 24 hours, and these images match the intelligence report. Israeli warplanes took action. Firstly, the warplanes carried out 3 major attacks on the Hamas gathering area on Amal Main Street. As a result of the attack, the gathering area was destroyed, and Osam al-Husseini, a member of the Hamas political bureau, was neutralized. In addition, it was stated that a large number of Hamas terrorist organization members were guarding the meeting area, and approximately 15 Hamas militants were neutralized as a result of the attack. But the attacks were not limited to this. After the critical target was destroyed, it was observed that 6 more fighter jets mobilized and attacked 9 more points in the Gaza Strip. It was reported that ammunition depots, shipping points, and tunnel entrances belonging to Hamas were destroyed in the attacks. As you can see, before the land operation begins, senior officials and the points that Hamas will use the most in the land operation are destroyed in order to completely break the resistance of Hamas and disrupt the coordination. At the same time, Hezbollah announced that it would go to war against Israel, and attacks by the Hezbollah terrorist organization began on the northern line. The Iranian-backed group launched its first attack on Shlomi Point with mortars simultaneously. The second attack was carried out in the Barim settlement in the town of Yerin, and it was detected that an Israeli army outpost was being targeted. The third and fourth attacks were carried out on outposts in the Margaliyat and Al-Bayada areas on the northern line. There were no casualties as a result of the attacks, but minor material damage was observed. After these attacks on Hezbollah, the largest air operation of the last period started against Hezbollah camps and ammunition depots on the southern line of Lebanon. Israeli warplanes and artillery units launched attacks on 12 separate Hezbollah camps and ammunition depots in southern Lebanon. Initially, unmanned aerial vehicles captured a large number of images of the locations of the strikes, and the coordinates were shared with the pilots and artillery units. As the Israeli artillery units launched their first strikes towards southern Lebanon, warplanes took to the air. Israeli artillery forces launched more than 700 artillery strikes along the border line, while Israeli warplanes began to destroy Hezbollah terrorist camps and ammunition depots in sequence. As a result of the first attacks, it was reported that a total of 17 Hezbollah members were neutralized, while 4 Hezbollah camps and 7 ammunition depots were successfully destroyed. In support of Hamas, the Hezbollah terrorist organization began to actively launch moderate attacks on Israeli territory. Under pressure from Iran, Hezbollah announced the declaration of war on Israel. But I can say that a harsh and final statement came from Israel. Israeli Economy Minister Nir Barkat said that if Hezbollah attacks Israeli territory, we will organize an unprecedented attack on Iran. If a front opens in the north, we are sending a very clear message to Iran. If you continue with the attacks, we will wipe from the face of the earth all those who support terrorist organizations and every part of Iran that supports terrorism. While the statements were made, it was observed that the F-35 fighter jets of the Israeli Air Force were deployed loaded with ammunition. The Israeli army was seen to keep the modernized F-35 fighter jets on alert against a possible attack by Iran. The F-35 fighter jets of the Israeli Air Force were modernized, and the fuel tanks were enlarged 2 times. Because the maximum range of a fighter jet traveling from Israel can reach the Iranian border in the event of a possible operation, these fighter jets will have to advance to Tehran. If the F-35 fighter jets refuel near the border, it will directly activate Iranian air defense systems. F-35 fighter jets stand out with their stealth. However, they can be clearly detected during refueling. For this reason, these fighter jets have been modernized for bombing, and their fuel tanks have been enlarged. The F-35s are currently in Israel and can directly target any point in Tehran. We know that Iran has major deficiencies in air defense systems, especially radar. Probably, after the Israeli airstrikes take place, Tehran will realize that attacks will be organized. On the other hand, with the Gaza land operation, it seems likely that an intervention will be carried out against the Hezbollah terrorist organization and Iran because, as I mentioned, both Iran and Hezbollah will take action with the start of the operation in Gaza. I can say that the main reason for the increase in the attacks of terrorist groups in recent days and Iran's attack statements is that the ground operation will start in a very short time. In this process, the ground operation can start at any moment. From the satellite images published, it is evident that the Israeli army has completed its preparations. Both Hamas and Israel will try to make the best use of their strong points, but clearly, it is seen that the Israeli army has overwhelming superiority. Approximately 500,000 trained Israeli troops are currently deployed along the Gaza border and in many parts of the West Bank. Hamas, on the other hand, has 10,000 active fighters. In the event of a possible ground operation, this number is expected to rise to 100,000. But Hamas's army of volunteers will be inexperienced and untrained. Only senior Israeli commanders know the details of the plan and the timing of the attack, but the outlines of Israel's action can be surmised. The all-out attack is certain to begin at night. Most Israeli soldiers have been issued night vision goggles and trained to use them to see in the dark. More importantly, Israel's air assets, manned aircraft, helicopters, and pilotless drones can also operate in pitch darkness. The Palestinian defenders certainly have some night vision equipment, but no ability to target and shoot down flying assets at night, except possibly a chance shot at a low-flying helicopter. Because of the narrowness of the strip, most Israeli bombers will be able to launch their explosive munitions from outside Gaza airspace over Israeli territory on the eastern side and over the Mediterranean Sea on the western side. The horseshoe-shaped airspace to the west, north, and east of the Gaza Strip will be crowded with Israeli aircraft minutes before the forces mobilize. Converted civilian Gulfstream and Super King Air aircraft of the Israeli Air Force will begin to intercept communications with electronic countermeasures. The electronic interference will render mobile phones inoperable, and the first wave of bombing will target communications towers, cutting off all Hamas communications. Other communications on the ground, including internet and telephone lines, will be electronically intercepted and rendered unusable. This will be followed, probably around midnight, by coordinated land and naval attacks from several directions simultaneously. This will give the attackers a 6-hour night vision advantage, at a time when most of the Arab world and Europe are asleep and the Americans are preparing to call it a day. Israeli forces will want to meet Hamas's first attack with daylight. In the meantime, Israeli forces will carry out gradual mopping up operations, cutting off the Gaza Strip between the south and the north. But as I mentioned, I can say that this is a theory based on the position of the Israeli army and published reports. A possible ground operation will be very difficult and long-lasting. The images of the crisis in the Middle East are growing by the day. Israeli officials say more than 1,400 people have been killed and more than 4,500 wounded in Israel so far, according to the U.S. State Department. At least 32 of those killed in Israel are Americans, according to the Palestinian Health Authority. At least 3,400 people were killed and more than 12,000 2,000 wounded in Gaza. There is still no news of the 203 people taken hostage by Hamas. All these casualties angered Israel, and unfortunately, the war intensified. At around 6:30 a.m. local time, air raid sirens sounded in Jerusalem, and Israel warned all citizens that the attack was in progress. Israel told all its citizens to take cover immediately. According to the Israel Defense Forces, an estimated 2,200 rockets were fired by Hamas militants into southern and central Israel, including Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Hamas, meanwhile, claims that at least 5,000 rockets were fired, all of which landed in southern and central Israel. After all this, Israel launched a massive wave of attacks. Here are the details of that attack. At first light, the Israeli army opened fire on Hamas militants. The fire was so rapid that Hamas had nowhere to run with accurate fire. The Israeli army destroyed 100 targets belonging to Hamas. This achievement in a few hours motivated the Israeli army immensely. The Israeli army destroyed an underground tunnel, weapons depots, and dozens of operational command centers. According to the statement, Hamas naval officer Amjad Majd Mohammed Abu Abdi was killed during early morning Israeli airstrikes. There was no official confirmation from Hamas. Israeli soldiers did not stop with this attack alone. The Israel Defense Forces announced that one of its drones shot down a militant on Lebanese territory last night. Amid heightened tensions on the Israel-Lebanon border, the Israel Defense Forces added that their forces also struck several military assets belonging to the Lebanese militant group Hezbollah in response to rockets fired from Lebanon into Israel. Israeli forces and Lebanese armed groups have been shelling the Gaza Strip since the start of the latest war between the Israeli army and Hamas, the Palestinian militant group that rules the territory. Hezbollah's strong support for Hamas has fueled fears that the war could spread to Lebanon. Israel has evacuated its own communities near Gaza and Lebanon, relocating residents to hotels elsewhere in the country. The Defense Ministry announced evacuation plans for Kiryat Shmona, a town of more than 20,000 residents near the Lebanese border. 3 Israelis, including a 5-year-old girl, were wounded in a rocket attack there. According to the Israeli Medical Services, the Hezbollah militant group in Lebanon, which has a huge arsenal of long-range rockets, exchanges fire with Israel almost daily along the border. Hezbollah has hinted that it might join the war if Israel tries to destroy Hamas. Iran supports both armed groups. Deadly violence is on the rise in the Israeli-occupied West Bank, according to Palestinian and Israeli officials. 13 Palestinians and 1 Israeli officer were killed in clashes yesterday. The worst clashes broke out in the Nur Shams refugee camp, a densely populated residential area that Israeli forces raided yesterday morning. The Israeli army said the forces detained wanted persons, disrupted terrorist infrastructure, and confiscated weapons. Palestinians in the camp responded to the Israeli attack by shooting at Israeli soldiers and throwing improvised explosive devices at them. An Israeli officer was killed in the aftermath of this attack. Palestinian health officials said 13 Palestinians were killed in clashes in Nur Shams. The Israeli army reported that one of its officers was killed. Israel also carried out a rare drone strike during the raid, saying it was attacking an armed terrorist organization that endangered our forces. The Nur Shams refugee camp was not the only hotspot. Palestinians have been protesting and clashing with Israeli troops in several West Bank towns. Israeli forces carried out simultaneous raids in Bethlehem, Hebron, Jericho, Nablus, and Ramallah yesterday, searching for militants linked to Hamas. Since then, Palestinian human rights groups have reported that more than 70 Palestinians have been killed in clashes with Israeli forces and armed Israeli settlers in the West Bank. This is by far the highest figure for 2 consecutive weeks this year. Israeli officers arrested hundreds of people, according to Palestinian and Israeli accounts. The Israeli army announced today that more than 375 of those arrested were Hamas members. Television news footage broadcast yesterday showed Israeli army trucks driving through Palestinian settlements and soldiers running through alleyways under cover of darkness. Palestinian medics reported that Israeli soldiers were preventing them from reaching the wounded. Arab news channels reported that some of the wounded had bled to death. Israeli officials could not immediately be reached for comment on the allegation. United Nations officials said they were increasingly concerned about the escalating violence. Ravina Shamdasani, spokesperson for UN Human Rights Chief Volker Turk, said that we are extremely concerned about the rapidly deteriorating human rights situation in the occupied West Bank and the increase in the unlawful use of lethal force. Shamdasani also added that tighter restrictions on the movement of Palestinians in the West Bank have prevented some from accessing healthcare in critical conditions. United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres visited the crossing point from Gaza to Egypt. Guterres called for the rapid delivery of aid to Gaza, describing it as the difference between life and death. More than 100 trucks carrying humanitarian aid waited to enter the Gaza Strip from Egypt this morning, but the Egyptian-controlled Rafah border crossing remained closed. According to Jens Lerck, spokesman for the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, aid convoys will be allowed into war-ravaged Gaza in the coming days. We are in deep and advanced discussions with all parties involved to ensure that an aid operation to Gaza can begin as soon as possible and under the right conditions, Lerck said. We are encouraged by reports that the different parties are nearing agreement on the modalities and that the first delivery will begin within the next day or so, Lerck added. At a press conference in Tel Aviv, Israel Defense Forces spokesman Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hecht did not specify when aid from Egypt would be allowed into Gaza, but Hecht confirmed that no agreement had yet been reached and that the border crossing was not open. President Joe Biden declared to Americans last night that U.S. leadership holds the world together. Biden said the country must deepen its support for Ukraine and Israel in the midst of two very different, unpredictable, and bloody wars. Biden made some remarks. These conflicts may seem far away as Biden prepares to ask Congress for billions of dollars in military aid for both countries, but he insisted in a rare Oval Office speech that they remain vital to America's national security. Biden said that history has taught us that when terrorists do not pay for their terror and when dictators do not pay for their aggression, they cause more chaos, more death, and more destruction. They continue to do so, and the cost and threat to America and the world continue to rise. Biden's speech reflected a broad view of U.S. obligations abroad, at a time when he faces political resistance at home to additional funding. Biden is expected to ask for $105 billion today. This includes $60 billion for Ukraine, much of it to replenish the stockpiles of weapons the U.S. has already provided. As we can see, Israel's biggest supporter has been the U.S. from the very beginning.